Hi everyone, my name is Matt, and welcome to my channel. Let's paint this Space Wolf in an old school layered painting style. When I assembled the model, I cut a couple of the parts off and replaced them with some Space Wolf parts from my bits box. I find it easier to paint the backpack separately, so I attached it to a cork with a piece of wire. I undercoated the model with a light gray primer, then I base coated it with the Fang gray using my airbrush. If you don't have an airbrush, you could just as easily use a paintbrush to base coat it. Check out this Blood Angels video here to see how I go about it. The first thing to do is touch up any areas the airbrush missed. I like my Space Wolves to be a little on the darker side, so I'm starting with the Fang gray instead of the usual lighter gray that most people go with. Next I'm going to shade the cracks in the armor with a mix of Rhinox hide and the Fang gray, thinned slightly with water. If you don't want to mix anything for this step, try using Agrax Earthshade instead. Carefully paint the shade into all the recesses, doing your best to be as neat as possible. If you make any mistakes, that's alright. In fact, it's kind of unavoidable in some areas. So just let it dry and you can touch it up with the base coat later. On some areas, like these things on his back, I find it easier to paint the whole area with the shade. Then I can pick out the highlights later. We'll leave the armor for now and move on to base coating and shading the other areas. Next I painted the joints with Dawnstone. Then I shaded those with Black Templar. Some spillover will be unavoidable here, especially around the neck. I just try to minimize it as much as possible, and any mistakes will get corrected all at once later. Next I base coated the leather areas with Rhinox hide. If you want a contrast version for this recipe, check out my Aldari Ranger's guide here. The end result is really close. Next I thinned down some black paint with water and shaded the leather. I'm focusing on any areas where the leather overlaps itself and anywhere it touches the armor. Next I'm going to base coat all the metal areas in 2 stages, beginning with a coat of Iron Warriors. Then I painted a layer of Iron Hand steel, leaving some of the Iron Warriors showing in the recesses. I like painting it this way because it gives a little bit of shading, and it isn't as bright as Iron Hand steel would be on its own. I shaded the steel areas with an equal parts mix of Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade, a mix I affectionately call Armor Wash. I use it a lot, and I'd recommend mixing a whole pot of it. Check out this video here to see how I go about mixing a custom color. Next I painted the wolf pelt with Steel Legion Drab. Then I painted the bottom half with a heavy dry brush of Zandri dust. And then I shaded the entire pelt with Seraphim Sepia. I painted the skin with Kislev flesh, thinned slightly with water. This is a pretty light color, and we'll need 2 or 3 layers for an even finish. Then I shaded the skin with Darkoath Flesh Contrast paint. This paint is a similar color to the Flesh Shade paint, but it's stronger. I find it tends to save time because I can get away with 1 layer rather than 2 or 3 layers of the shade paint. Next I painted the bolter with black. I want a solid, even finish, so I painted a second layer after the first one dried. I also sketched out the pack markings on the shoulder and knee pad. With the black paint still on my palette, I thinned it slightly with water and painted a thin black outline around the unpainted details. The purity seal, the shoulder pad, and a few details around the face mask. I painted the parchment with Zandri dust. Then I shaded the parchment with Steel Legion Drab, thinned with water. I painted a small amount into the gap and in some of the folds. I painted the wax part of the purity seal with Khorne red. And then shaded it with my armor wash mix. Next I painted all the brass and gold details with Balthasar gold. Then I painted the rune stones with Dawnstone. Nothing says Space Wolves like an orange mohawk, and Skrag brown will make a good base for it. Next I shaded the gold, stones, and hair with Agrax Earthshade. The last base coat to lay down is the yellow shoulder pad. A lot of painters find yellow to be one of the toughest colors to paint, and I think the secret is patience and a lot of thin layers. I'm starting off the process with some thinned Averland Sunset yellow. Notice how a lot of the gray is still showing through. It'll take a few layers before we get a solid coat. You may be tempted to put the paint on thicker, but I'd advise against it. It's really important to take your time and go with a lot of thin layers. It'll pay off in the end and you'll get a much smoother result. A smooth surface is especially important if you plan on applying any decals. Most Space Marine model kits have the shoulder pads as separate parts, and that makes things way easier because you can just prime them white and airbrush them yellow. But this pad is attached to the rest of the model, so that makes things more difficult. I like a real bright yellow on my Space Wolves, so now I'm going to build up a brighter finish with a few thin layers of Yriel yellow paint. I like the bright yellow because I feel it complements the dark armor more, and it's kind of a tribute to the old, bright style. If you prefer the more muted yellow, then I'd just skip this step. The yellow took a little while, but it's looking really smooth and even. I mixed some Troll Slayer orange into the Yriel yellow and thinned it with water. Then I painted some subtle shading around the outside. Then I went back to the black paint and added a thin outline. And finally touched up the gray trim as well. The base coats are all done and the model's looking pretty sharp, so let's start on the highlights. The most time-consuming part is the armor, so let's tackle that first. For the first armor highlight, I'm using an equal parts mix of Fang and Russ Gray, and I mixed up a couple bottles of it. Custom mixes are a great way to speed up the painting process, and if you mix up enough of it, you'll only have to mix it once. Plus, it will keep your army looking consistent throughout the whole painting process. I'm making the first highlight fairly wide. This model needs to match an army I started painting a long time ago, and my painting style at that time had very bold looking highlights. If I was starting fresh now, I'd probably make the highlights a little more narrow. Work all the way around the model and pick out all the edges. I painted the next highlight with Russ Gray. I made this highlight a little more narrow than the first. I like to vary the line width slightly, making the highlight wider on the upward facing edges and more narrow on the bottom facing edges. I'd like to take this moment to thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying the video so far, please click the like button. And don't forget to subscribe too if you haven't done so yet. It really helps out the channel, and doing so will ensure you don't miss out on any future content. Next I highlighted the armor with Fenrisian Gray. For this highlight I tried to focus on just the top edges and corners. If you're interested in a more in-depth guide about highlighting with heavy metal style techniques, check out this video here. For the final highlight I used Frostbite from P3. If you don't have this color, try mixing white and Fenrisian Gray. This color is a pretty big step up in value, so try to keep the lines very narrow and restricted to the sharpest corners and edges. I also try to focus more of the highlights on the top half of the model, and have fewer highlights on the lower half. With all the armor done, I need a palette cleanser with a couple small and fast areas. Let's highlight the skin with some thinned Kislev flesh. I like to thin it down with a little water and make a few glazes. There should be very little paint on the brush, and it should dry almost immediately. Then I mixed in a little white and added another highlight. While we're working on the face, let's go ahead and tackle the eyes. I painted them black during one of the earlier stages, so with a little white paint on the brush, carefully paint the eyes, making sure to leave a thin black outline. Then I painted the pupils with a small dot of black. I like to pay special attention to where the model's looking. Consider the pose and what kind of story you want to tell with it. Next I'm going to highlight the leather with Doombull brown in 2 stages. The first stage is more of a blended glaze highlight. Thin the paint with water, and with very little paint on the brush, paint it near the edges and folds. There should be barely any paint coming off the brush, and it should dry almost immediately. Build up a few layers, making a gradual blend. Then grab some undiluted paint and make a fine line highlight on the edges. This edge looks a little too sharp, so I went back with the glaze and smoothed it out. Another method is to paint the edge highlights first, and then blend your way to them with a glaze. Both methods work well and are interchangeable. Depending on what you're painting, one method might work better than another. I painted the next highlight with Skrag brown, this time without any glazes. Just a thin, sharp line on the edges, and more narrow than the first highlight. While I had Skrag brown on my brush, I highlighted the hair with a stippling kind of brush mark. For the last highlight I'm using Tau Light Ochre, and painting it on the sharpest edges and corners. Once in a while I'll mix in some white for a final dot highlight, but I think that would be a little excessive on this model. Moving on to the hair, I mixed some Fire Dragon into the Skrag brown and painted a bunch of dots along the mohawk. Then I painted Fire Dragon along the edges and a few dots on the very top. Next I highlighted the black areas, beginning with Eshin Grey. I like to highlight the edges of the pack markings as well. I think it makes it look like it's engraved on the armor rather than painted on. Some painters don't highlight it, so it's up to you. I'm skipping over the black areas and the joints for this stage. Since I did the base coat and shade approach at the start, it kind of functions as the first highlight and saves some time. On some really small areas, you might find it easier to paint the whole part gray first, and then go back and paint the inside with black. For the next highlight I used Dawnstone, making these lines more narrow and focused on the top edges and corners. And finally I picked out a few of the sharpest corners with Frostbite Grey. Next I highlighted all the gold areas with Retributor armor. On the flat areas I like to start out with a glaze, kind of like how I highlighted the first stage of the leather. Then I'll go in with undiluted paint and pick out all the edges. Then I mixed a very small amount of gold with Stormhost silver for the final highlight. I find it easier to start with silver on the palette, and then add a tiny amount of gold. With some thinned iron hand steel, I glazed over some of the steel areas. The shade earlier dulled down the reflectiveness of the metal, and painting on a thin glaze is kinda like polishing it. Then I picked out the edges with the Stormhost silver. I highlighted the parchment in 2 stages with Bonewhite, beginning with a few very thin glazed layers. After I made some soft highlights, I used some undiluted paint and picked out the edges. Then I thinned some black paint down with water, and with very little paint on the brush, I painted the lettering. When you grab paint with your brush, roll the brush as you drag it along your palette, and it will help form the hair into a fine point. I highlighted the wax part of the purity seal with Khorne red mixed with some Bonewhite. Try to keep the highlights small and narrow, otherwise it can end up looking pink. I highlighted the rune stones with Dawnstone, painting over most of them except for the engraved runes themselves. Then I mixed some Bonewhite into the Dawnstone and highlighted the edges. I highlighted the wolf pelt with Zandri dust, focusing mostly on the middle section of it. Then I highlighted the bottom section with Bonewhite. Next I painted all the rivets, gems, and lenses with black. And then I painted all the rivets with Stormhost silver, leaving a thin black outline around them. I decided to go with two different colors for the gems, red and green. For the red lenses, I started with Khorne red and painted a thin layer, focusing more of the paint near the bottom. Next I painted a thin layer of Evil Sunz Scarlet, a little closer to the bottom in a crescent kind of shape. Then I painted an even finer crescent shape with Fire Dragon. followed by a very small amount of toxic yellow. Finally, I added a dot of white near the top. I took the same approach for the green lenses, beginning with Caliban green, followed by Warpstone glow, and then a smaller amount of moot green. Then I mixed some moot green and Dorn yellow for the final highlight. I painted a dot of white on the top as well. The last thing to take care of is the shoulder pad, which is still in need of a company marking. I applied a decal to the shoulder pad using microset. This is where all those thin layers of yellow really pay off. The smoother the surface is, the easier the decal will go on. And afterwards I painted a thin layer of medium to seal in the decal and remove the shine. Next I highlighted the rest of the shoulder pad with a thin glaze highlight of Flashgitz yellow. And finally toxic yellow on the edges. I attached the backpack with superglue, and then I used an old brush to apply a generous layer of wood glue to the base. Then I sprinkled on coarse gravel and fine sand. After the glue dried, I painted the base with a layer of thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a dry brush of Mournfang brown, and then Balor brown. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, shaded them with Agrax Earthshade, dry brushed with Dawnstone, followed by a mix of Dawnstone and Bonewhite. I painted the edge of the base with Rhinox hide, and after that dried, I applied some patches of static grass with superglue. Well, all that edge highlighting was a lot of work, but I think it's worth it. Few things are as cool as an Eavy Metal Space Marine. Is there a Space Marine chapter you'd like to see next? Drop a comment below and share your favorite chapter. Thanks for making it this far to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned a few things too. And don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps out the channel. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.